Well, hello. Nice to see you again. Now, I assume the reason you've returned is that you listened to my last YouTube or read my last blog where I talked about what motivated me to write my latest book. Can you see it there? It's all upside down. And I talked a little bit about what's in the book, such as the 26 upside down principles, which I'm sure you now know aren't really upside down. Uh, I suspect that the reason you've returned is that you may be a little bit curious about why I focus on principles in the book rather than the more traditional approach of focusing on best practices. Well, if that's the reason you've returned, it's your lucky day because that's exactly our topic for today. So let's get started. Let me give you a little bit of background here. In 2015, I was fortunate enough to be invited to speak at the Agile Africa Conference. And while at the conference, I listened to Kent Beck, who gave a keynote address. In that address, Kent talked about what he called policies, but what many of us would call principles that are used at Facebook. I found Kent's talk fascinating. He came out and he puts up one slide, and on that slide he had all the principles that he planned to talk about. And what he would do is he would highlight one principle at a time, and then he would just talk informally to that single slide about how practitioners at Facebook implement that principle. When I listened to this, it hit me. I gained this insight into how work actually gets done at Facebook. And what was amazing to me is Kent only used that single slide, and he never talked about practices in general or any best practices used at Facebook. Now, this led me to think about how practices are different from principles. And what I realized is that principles really focus on goals. They're more aligned with goals, whereas practices in general and best practices are more closely associated with approaches or steps to achieve a goal. Now don't misunderstand me. Best practices and practices are certainly needed. Less experienced people often need guidance in how to go about achieving a goal, and the more experienced people also need refreshers at times. However, and if there's one key point I hope you take away from this YouTube, it's this. There is a power in simply stated principles together with a clear goal that you can't get from practices alone. Now, for those who may challenge this assertion, in part one of the book, I share numerous stories of innovative activities that teams come up with to solve their problems on their own. One specific example in my story 2, I provide 4 specific examples of simple creative activities that a team uses to help solve a stakeholder challenge and a testing weakness that they know that they have. Now, just to make sure you understand, I'm not saying, don't want you to misunderstand, I'm not saying that best practices can't help. But what you learn from my stories in part 1 is how best practices, industry best practices, and best practices in general can't replace a team working together, listening to their teammates, brainstorming potential solutions to their challenges, agreeing on the path forward, actions to take. In closing this YouTube, I'd also like to point out that I'm not the only one to have observed the power of principles. Scott Ambler, the creator of Disciplined Agile Delivery and one of the reviewers of this book, told me that with Dad, they emphasize principles because people might actually read them and understand them. In my next YouTube and my next blog, I plan to talk more about why I actually included a part 2 to the book and what's in part 2. So I'd like to just thank you now for stopping by again and letting me share a little of my time with you. Have a great day. Thanks.